story. Let me tell you what's going on. Good morning, everyone. I guess it's 10 o'clock and it's time to begin. Happy New Year. Thank you. Did you all have a good New Year's Eve? Yeah. How many of you were here in the fabulous New Year's Eve party? Hopping, huh? Okay, good. 2 weeks from today, our very own Kristen Valentine will be here doing some readings for us, a little bit different type of program with some illustrations. And I think those of you who heard her last year know she is a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful reader. So here is Carter to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you, Larry. Our speaker today is Steve Hosa. Steve studies history, meets and supports historical figures, writes books, contributes and loans artifacts to museums, and tells very, very interesting stories. He is with us today to tell a story about experience and friendship. No, it's not about Wallace and Ladmo, although he might do that in the future. He has some very interesting history about them. Today he'll relate his experiences with special prisoners, ones who came to Arizona unwillingly, and some who left Arizona but really wanted to stay. They're German soldiers captured during World War II. He probably knows more about the Arizona German prisoners' experience than anyone else. Today, he will entertain you with some of these stories. Please welcome Steve Hosa to our stage.
I think you've got a speaker up there. Yep.
I don't know who this guy is, Carter, but I'd love to meet him. Well, good morning, everybody. Thanks for having me. I've been speaking on this subject now for almost 30 years, and this is a story that started. My first job out of college was at the Arizona State Archives, which was just above the State Capitol Museum, and a lot of the volunteer tour guides were people that had lived in Phoenix during World War II, and I was born and raised in Phoenix. I still live, in fact, I live about a mile west of here, and at lunchtime I would talk to the docents, and they would tell me stories about growing up in Phoenix, and one of the stories that they liked to talk about were the German prisoners of war, and I said this is something that I had never heard about growing up, and so I started to collect their stories. I'd start to tape record them, and then through friends I met other people, and then when the internet started in the late 80s, early 90s, I started to go out onto websites and ask if there was any former guards that worked at Papago. I got a hold of a lot of them, and I got so fascinated by the story, I thought, well, what was the Germans, what was their take on their captivity here? And a friend of mine at ASU put me in touch with this newspaper, which is no longer in circulation, called Der Heimkehrer. And you can see on I speak German, by the way, it says the voice of the war generation. And this used to go out to every living German war veteran living in Germany. I talked to the editor, and he allowed me to put, over a 2-year period, ads in the paper. On the back page was this search service. It literally says search service of der Heimkehrer, which means the homecomer, the one who come home. And I simply asked if there's anybody that was held at a POW camp in Arizona to please contact me. I'm interested in your story. And within a few months, I had over 100 responses from men. Some called me, Some came to visit me. Many came to visit after my book was published. I have 2 copies of my book here that I'm going to put in the library that you can read. And so I started to collect these stories, and I went to Germany, interviewed a lot of them. A lot of them came here. And I'm glad I did it the time I did, because the last man who I interviewed passed away last month at age 93. And so everything you're going to see and hear here is from their experiences. So the first Germans to come into captivity were captured by the British and their Commonwealth. And so this would have been U-boat crews on the high seas, and then German Air Force personnel that were captured during the Battle of Britain. And these prisoners were being held in British and Scottish camps. And then later, as they became full, they were sent over across the sea to Canada. So after America joined the war, after Pearl Harbor, our first major offensive against Germany was Operation Torch in Italy, and then later up through Sicily and then Italy. Then after D-Day, more and more prisoners started to fall into Allied hands, and it soon became very difficult to care for these prisoners in accordance with the Geneva Convention. So Winston Churchill and President Roosevelt met and decided to start sending the bulk of these prisoners to the United States. And so the first prisoners to come, these were mainly from the German Navy. The German Navy suffered the first major losses during the war. These were not only submarines, but surface ships also. Here's a famous picture. This was in Life magazine. These are prisoners coming off of an LST in Anzio. And you can see a lot of curiosity from the American sailors at the top looking at them. The Germans that I talked to, almost 100 of them, they all were in agreement that their treatment from the very start was very, very good. A lot of their fathers told them when the war started and they were drafted, if you have to be captured by the Americans, because their fathers were captured by the Americans in World War I, and he says they will take the best care. Here's another picture. These are prisoners coming by British landing craft after their capture in Normandy. You can see the British guards on the far right there. So when they were captured, they were given a card to fill out that would be sent by the Swiss Red Cross back to Germany to their parents, letting them know that they were alive and well. And they had photographs taken, they were fingerprinted, and then they were given prisoner of war clothing, so their uniforms were taken from them. Then here's a picture of one being loaded onto an empty Liberty ship going back to the United States. If you notice, he's coming on board the ship through a covered tunnel. They did not want the prisoners to see the harbor facilities so that they could not send any potential military information back in letters. So in total, by VE Day, May of '45, there were almost 500,000 German and Italian prisoners in the continental United States. The Italians were not held with the Germans. There was no love lost between the Italians and the Germans because of what happened in North Africa. There was a lot of hostility towards Italy and the Italians by the German armed forces. And so the Italians were held until the Italians surrender. They were then sent back to Italy, and the Germans started to occupy a lot of the camps in the United States. So in total, there was 511 camps in the United States. And obviously, the first ones were built on the East Coast, and then gradually they started to move westward. This is from my book. These are all of the camps that were in Arizona. And there we go. If you notice the location of most of them, they're all in the central part of the state where the agricultural belt is. Because of the severe labor shortage during the war, and I'll talk about this more later, the Germans were very instrumental in maintaining our agricultural economy from '44 to '46. So we had the two biggest camps were the two main camps, and these were camps that had permanent buildings. This would be in Camp Florence, which was the biggest in the state, the 5th largest in the country, and Camp Papago Park over near where the Phoenix Zoo is. But you had camps in Avondale, in Yuma, in Litchfield Park, Cortaro near Tucson. You had them also at some of the big air bases at Davis-Monthan and Marana, and even Luke. And then the Navajo Ordnance Depot up in Flagstaff. So Camp Florence was originally built as an enemy alien detention camp. These would have been ambassadors and government personnel that were trapped in the United States when the war started. Then it was later transferred or converted into a camp for American personnel being sent over to the Desert War in Africa. And here's a photograph of the main gate. These camps were built along the same plan, like the barracks were built along the same plan by the Army Corps of Engineers that were also used at air bases and also the Japanese-American internment camps. So when you see these barracks, they look almost identical to what you would have seen at Luke Army Airfield or Davis-Monthan Army Airfield, places like that. So the first prisoners to come to Florence, these were men that were captured in Africa, and one of the men that contacted me who was at Florence was Werner Hefner. And this is Werner as he looked when he was first captured, and that's how he looked when I met him in Germany. And he had actually been on the Russian front. And that's one of the few things that he would talk about, that he wouldn't talk about. He was a very, very jovial, very happy man, and he would sit down for hours taping his stories. And he says once he was transferred to the Russian front, he said, "It was hell on earth, I don't want to talk about it." And he was wounded there near Leningrad, and then he was sent to Italy to recuperate. And it was at that time that the Italians were getting their butts kicked by the British. And so the Africa Corps was hurriedly organized, and he was part of that. And so when they surrendered in May of '43, he didn't come directly to Arizona. He came to a camp in McLean, Texas, and that's Werner right there. And their clothing is obsolete World War I Army uniforms that were dyed, and then has the letters PW painted on them. You can see one prisoner has a pet dog right there. The second were a large number of regular Wehrmacht soldiers that were captured in France. Paul Zern, who lives near Stuttgart, gave me this picture. This is the picture on the left is the picture on his identification papers. And then the second, he was part of an anti-tank unit, a 37 millimeter pack gun. That's him with the X over his head. And they're heavily camouflaged at this time because the Allied air power was so great that they could only move mostly at night, but if they were heavily camouflaged to be able to blend into the countryside. Then you had the men who thought they were the elite of the military. This was the Fallschirmjäger, or the German paratroopers. And this is Friedrich Sommermeier, who held out at the Brest Fortress in France. They were actually cut off for many months before they finally surrendered. And he later became, on the right is a picture of him, he later became a colonel in the West German Army after the war. He went to a camp in Arkansas. That's him on the far right. And if you notice, they are wearing their Iron Crosses, and they have their jump medals on, too. When the war first started, the Americans, the guards, really didn't have a lot of experience dealing with the Germans, and they would often steal the medals off of their uniforms. And this caused a lot of resentment. And so an order went down by the U.S. Army, leave them alone. How would you like to have your medals taken off of you after you were captured? So what the Germans would do instead is in their art classes, they would make fake decorations like Iron Crosses and things, and they would trade them with the Americans for extra toilet articles and things like that. But you can see they all have their original Iron Crosses here. And this is my good friend Gerhard, who just passed away last month. Gerhard was 16 years old when he was captured. He was part of the Reichsarbeitsdienst, or the Reich Labor Service. And this was a precursor to the military. And he hated the military, he hated the war. He was part of an 88mm flak crew. He was captured in France and celebrated his 17th birthday when he arrived at the camp in Florence, Arizona. One of the strange stories about Florence, which I've never been able to find that this happened in any other camp, was when the prisoners came in, when new prisoners came in, Gerhard said that the other prisoners who had been there for a while started to shout to them, says, "Don't sign it, you'll be a traitor to your country, don't sign it." And he didn't know what they meant. Well, what it was is the prisoners had the option to sign a document, and I actually have a copy of it, an original copy that one of them gave me, and it was the not to escape document, and it was written in English and German, and it said that I swear as a German soldier, I promise never to escape, never to help anybody else escape, and to come back from my work duties in a timely manner. If you signed it, you were sent to a special part of the camp called the Democratic Camp, where you had more freedoms, you were guarded less strictly, and you could work outside of the camp. If you didn't sign it, which most of the paratroopers that I talked to didn't, you were sent to the Nazi compound, and the tar paper on your barracks were left black. You wore black dyed clothes, and the heels of your shoes were notched in such a way that if you did escape, they'd be very identifiable. And the guarding was much more strict, and you couldn't work outside. The guys who signed it were promised a quicker return to Germany when the war was over, and the Americans, that did happen. This is a drawing done by Karl Durst, one of the prisoners that was in the Democratic compound. I'm sorry, I have to look back because the picture is not appearing on the screen here, so excuse me for that. But Karl did this drawing in 1944 of what the camp in Florence looked like. These camps were literally a self-contained town. They had their own hospitals, they had their own fire departments, they had their own cemeteries, they had their own newspapers, they had their own motor pools, things like that. So according to Karl, compounds D through G were the Democratic compounds, compound A through C were the Nazi compounds. And there also was a large hospital. At this time, the closest hospital was in Coolidge. And when I did this talk down in Florence one time, I had residents of Florence come and show me their birth certificates, and it showed them being born at the POW camp in Florence. So here's a picture of the so-called Nazi compound. That's Post and Butte in the background, if you know the Florence area. So for the Democratic camp, the walls of your barracks were painted white, so they were a little less warm in the winter or in the summertime. And this is a picture looking in at the so-called Nazi compound. And here are some of the barracks from the Democratic camp. So the Democratic prisoners were given U.S. Army clothes that were painted with the letters PW on them. You can see them on their pants, and they had it on the backs of their shirts too, which I do have some. I should have brought some to show you. The Democratic prisoners, those that could speak English, were often used as interpreters. And this is Robert Beer. That's him right here. He was in the German army. He could speak a little English, so he was an interpreter at the camp hospital. And he became a Catholic priest after the war. And so this is him on the right when I took him down to Florence to see the old campsite. Okay, this is an overview of the camp. This is looking west. So the town of Florence is back here. The Arizona State Prison is back here. So you can see the Democratic camp here with the white, and here's the Nazi camp with the black. So Papago Park. The camp at Papago Park, which is the most famous, and you'll find out in a little while why, started life as a civilian conservation corps camp during the New Deal. Then later it was converted to a desert training center for men going over to Africa in Operation Torch, and was then converted to a POW camp in September, October of 43. And one of the subcontractors on all of these camps was the Del Webb Corporation. Del Webb also built, or was a subcontractor on all of the main Army airfields. Kingman Army Airfield, where my dad was stationed, Luke, Davis-Monthan, Douglas, Williams. In fact, Del Webb became so rich during the war that he became co-owner of the New York Yankees. This is the official Army Corps of Engineers plan of the camp at Papago. So to give you an idea of where it was, McDowell Road would be here, Thomas Road would be here, and 64th Street runs right through the center of the camp. And then you have the Army, the Arizona Crosscut Canal. So the Phoenix Zoo today is just down here. It held about 3,200 prisoners, but the population fluctuated greatly because a lot of the prisoners would be taken and sent to other states. So for instance, Paul Cern, the Wehrmacht anti-tank gunner, said that right after arriving in Florence, he was sent down to Tucson to pick oranges. Then he was sent up to Idaho to pick potatoes. Then he was sent over to California to pick another crop. So the population fluctuated greatly as the different harvests were being taken in. So at Papago, this was a camp for naval personnel only. And this was a practice done in Germany for the Allied POWs. They did not keep men of the different services in the same camps so that you would not have the friction that you have. So the U-boat people thought they were the elite of the German military. You would not mix them in with the paratroopers who thought they were the elite of the German military. So these were for German Navy personnel only. And the first group to come in were from German submarines. And one of the first men to contact me through the newspaper was Alfred Dietrich. He was a crewman on the U-162, and it operated in the Gulf of Mexico, and that's where it was sunk. Here's a picture of the crew. This is Alfred right up here. And the captain of the submarine was Jürgen Wattenberg. That's him in the white cap. He would become the senior ranking officer at Papago and the leader of the Big Escape in Christmas of 1944. They took on 3 British destroyers in the Gulf of Mexico and lost. They were depth charged, came to the surface, they were all evacuated, 2 died, and then the sub sank. And they were sent to Florida, they went to Crossville, Tennessee, Stringtown, Oklahoma, and then to Arizona. The second big group, these were land-based naval personnel. This is Hans Lammersdorf, who became an American citizen after the war. He moved to Seattle, Washington, and he was a flak gunner in the port of Bizerta in Tunis. And he said the moment he stepped off the train in Tempe, he said he instantly fell in love with Arizona and knew that's where he wanted to spend the rest of his life. Then you had men that served on German merchant ships, and the crews of 3 of these ships were the Weserland, the Burgenland, and believe it or not, the Rio Grande, scuttled themselves off the coast of Africa so as not to be captured, and they protested their treatment as prisoners of war. They even tried to go to a congressional level to say, hey, we are merchant mariners only, we're not prisoners of war. And the Americans said, yes, you are, because you supplied submarines with torpedoes on the high seas and you had anti-aircraft weapons on your ships. So this is Werner Weber, who was the radio officer on one of these ships, the Burgenland. He lived in Hamburg when I went to see him. Then you had, here's the guy from the Rio Grande, Karl Horst Hille. He later worked at a gas station in Tucson. There's a picture of him working alongside some of the American airmen from the Davis-Monthan Army Airfield. And these radio guys, what they did, they knew they had memorized all of the frequencies of these German radios. And so they made themselves, from an old Emerson radio, they made themselves a shortwave radio, a secret shortwave radio. They were able to get German war broadcasts in Papago, and they hid it under the floorboards of the barracks. So all prisoners had to be photographed. They were given an ID number, and every single German that I interviewed could still recite his prisoner of war number from heart. And they had to be photographed. Like, for instance, the German Navy was the only service where the men were allowed to grow beards. And so when they were captured, they had to have a photograph with their beard. They had to shave it off and have another picture taken, so that if they ever tried to escape and they tried to hide their identity, they would have photographs of that. So these photographs followed them all out through their captivity. And here is a basic personnel record. This is the typical information sheet that followed the prisoners. This is from Heinrich Palmer, one of the 25 who escaped from Papago Park. He gave this to me when I visited him in Germany. One of the mysteries of Papago, and one of the reasons, did anybody here ever work for a newspaper? Okay, well, forgive me what I'm going to say, but there is a ton of misinformation out there about not only the escape, but who was being held at Papago, and it was because of the press. I'm not sure how this story got going, but these articles, this is from the Arizona Republic from December of '44. The mystery was solved. Submarine Commander Gunther Preen, who became very famous right after the war started. He sank the British battleship Royal Oak in Scapa Flow, Scotland. Became nationally famous, personally decorated by Hitler. Then in 1942, he failed to return from a patrol, and it was never determined what happened to him. Well, these articles started to appear worldwide. It was in Stars and Stripes. It was in newspapers overseas. The mystery is solved. Gunther Preen's being held in Papago Park. And it was even rumored, and this was in the Arizona Republic too, that he was the leader of the escape in 1944. Well, it wasn't revealed till after the war that he had been killed along with his entire crew 2 years before Papago ever opened. So that's why I call him the Phantom Prisoner. This is the problem with using newspapers as primary sources of information. Newspapers are not there to document history. They're there to sell advertising space. And if I was to tell you right now to go to the Tempe Library and go to the microfilm and write me a report about the escape just using the Arizona Republic, you'd have the date of the escape wrong, the method of escape wrong, the number of men who escaped wrong, and you'd have a dead man leading the whole thing. So this is sometimes very difficult to fight because, like I say, I've been speaking about this for a long time, and I've gotten into some tussles with people that insisted it was this way because that's the way they read it, and that's the way it was. It's like, no, it's not. So forgive me if I insulted anybody about that. So these are some of the pictures from Papago. These were one-story buildings as opposed to Florence that were two-story barracks. You can see a little bit of the McDowell Mountains in the background there. This is looking to the northeast. This is one of the many guard towers that surrounded the camp. The guards at these POW camps, most of these were 4Fers who couldn't qualify for military service. They were sent into military police training, and most of them graduated from a school in Battle Creek, Michigan. And the man that gave me this picture was a guard at Papago. He was the man who discovered the escape tunnel, and Larry had only one eye. And he said all of the men in his company had only one eye. And a lot of them were extremely heavy, or they had other kind of physical ailments. So the guarding was not top class, mainly because the Americans thought that they could not escape. How could they escape? Most of the Germans didn't speak English. You needed ration coupons to buy anything. And they were so far out in the desert, and the caliche on which the camp was built was so hard, they can't tunnel out. Oh, yes, they did. The prisoners could write home twice a month on special stationery provided by the Americans. So if you notice, this is from Alfred Dietrich from the U-162 to his father. And if you notice, there are 2 censor stamps on it. The U.S. censor stamp, there was a department at the Pentagon where the mail from all 400,000 Germans came and was read before they were sent back to Germany to make sure there was no military secrets being passed or any negative propaganda about being mistreated. So they were examined there. Then when they got to Germany, they went to Berlin, and here is the Nazi censor stamp, and it says opened. And they would look at it for positive propaganda. They did not want the families to know that they were being treated well and being well cared for. And if that happened, the information was censored. It was cut out with a razor blade. And Alfred told me that he doesn't remember exactly what he said, but he said something a little bit too positive about his treatment, and it was cut out. Then you could have picture postcards too. This is Werner Weber from the Burgenland, and they had a camp photographer at Papago that would take the prisoners' pictures, and they would be made into a postcard, which they can then send. This was sent to his father, and you can see the U.S. censor stamp here, and there's the Nazi censor stamp here. And then there were regular postcards, very small, in which you could also write. This was to his then girlfriend, which later became his wife. And he said, after a while, you really couldn't say anything. You didn't want to say anything too positive because the Germans would censor it. You didn't want to say anything too negative because the Americans would censor it. So they said it was just, I'm fine, hope you're well, hope the family's well, and that was pretty much it. They couldn't say much about the work that they were doing and that kind of thing. So he said the news going back and forth was extremely bland. And they could receive mail from home. This is a postcard that Werner got just before he was sent home, and this came from his parents and Bertha. And so, excuse me, should have turned that off. So this came to him when he was being held at the camp at Davis-Monthan. And it says, regarding these people, the people that they know in the neighborhood, everybody is okay. Here is to an early and healthy return to the homeland. Heartfelt greetings, your parents and Bertha. Dated 22 January 46. So this is some of the guards at Papago lining up in the morning for inspection. And if you know where that mountain is, this is Barnes Butte. This is along McDowell Road just before 56th Street. And the Germans called this the Sleeping Indian Mountain. See if you can find the face of the Indian in it. While you're looking, I'm going to tell you that even today, the Germans are crazy about the Old West. Absolutely crazy about the Old West. There was a German author named Karl May. Back in the early 1900s, he wrote a series of adventure stories for youth, and they were all set in Arizona, and it was all cowboys and Indians. It was Winnetou and Old Shatterhand, and they've been reprinted. You can still find them nowadays. There were a few movies made. Stuart Granger, I believe, starred in them. They were all German-made films. So when a lot of these guys heard they were coming to Arizona, they were quite excited. Oh, wow, the land of cowboys and Indians. They were just thrilled. Even to this day, if you go down to Tombstone and go to the different gift shops, the only other language they have their books printed in is German, not even Spanish. Look at the guest register, Germany, 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 Germany. When my wife and I were there, we went to a Wild West festival in the little village we were staying. We were staying with one of the former prisoners, and they brought us to this Wild West festival. They're all wearing cowboy hats and boots. Somebody brought a horse. And when they introduced us, they says, this is Stephen Marlowe. They're from Arizona. My God, it's like we were treated like royalty. They just, and then they wanted to know why I wasn't wearing a cowboy hat and cowboy boots. So, which I've never owned a pair in my life. So a lot of their artwork that the prisoners did was all Western themed. So here is the face of the Indian. Here's his forehead. Here's his nose. And here's his mouth. He's looking up like this. And here's a drawing that one of them did of the sleeping Indian at night. Here's the barracks in which the prisoners slept in. They slept on army cots. No air conditioning. They said it was extremely hot. Here's the camp theater where they could put on plays. And then later, they had movies. They had a lot of, for some reason, they're not sure, a lot of Shirley Temple movies. Later dubbed into German, and their favorite comedy team, Laurel and Hardy. Laurel and Hardy made a lot of their shorts in German. Dick and Doof is what they call them in Germany, fat and stupid. And so they had a lot of Laurel and Hardy, but they could also put on plays. And here's some of the murals along the walls. You can see they're all cowboys. Here's two cowboys, or two Indians here. Here's a ranch. There's a cowboy on horseback there. This is a view from a guard tower looking down into the officers' compound. So Wattenberg would have had his hut here. They lived in 1- and 2-man huts. That's the camp power plant in the background. This is the camp hospital. This is looking south. So the Phoenix Zoo today is right here. One of the more darker stories concerns this prisoner, Werner Drexler. He was on a U-boat, and they were being interrogated. He and his mates were being interrogated in Virginia, and his fellow crewmen thought that he had gotten a little too friendly with the Americans and gave them a little bit too much information. And 6 hours later, after he was sent to Papago, he was found beaten to death and hanged in one of the wash barracks. The FBI came in, did an investigation, and I talked to several of the men from his boat and also the guard who found his body. And 6 U-boat men were convicted of murder, and they were all hanged at Fort Leavenworth. Unfortunately, this was not the only incident. There was a killing in Oklahoma and several others too. So the one story that I think is the most important, everybody wants to latch onto the escape, which in my opinion is historically insignificant, is the work program. Because of the great labor shortage during the war, we did have the Bracero program that sent laborers from Mexico. Most of these went to California and back east. Very few came to Arizona. So the prisoners were our salvation when it came to the agricultural economy in Arizona. By the end of the war, they picked almost 95% of our cotton crop. And the Germans enjoyed getting out and working. They were paid for it. They worked for the precursor to Salt River Project, which was the Salt River Valley Water Users Association. I talked to prisoners that were gardeners at the Arizona Biltmore. They worked at laundries downtown. This is one of them, Friedrich Mughal from the U-162. He worked for the Salt River Valley Water Users Association. In the summertime, when the canals were full, they would use scythes and cut all the brush from along the sides of the canal to make them look nice. And then in the winter, when they were dry, they would take in shovels and they would dig the canals out because they were not lined with concrete. So they were digging all the old sediment out of it. And this is a drawing done by Ernst Winter in 1945 at the camp down at Davis-Monthan Field in Tucson. And their job was to conserve all the B-29s coming back from Pacific War duty. They would drain all the fluids, they would mothball them, and Ernst gave me a little toiletry kit and a wallet that he made out of the leather from a pilot seat of a B-29. And here is Carl Horst Hille, the radio officer from the Rio Grande. Remember him? And here he is right here. When it was found out that he was a mechanic also, he worked at a gas station in Tucson, just down the street from Davis-Monthan. He remembers the names of everyone in this picture, and this story is in my book also. And these are all airmen from Davis-Monthan that he worked alongside with, and he said it was one of the nicest times in his entire life was working there at the gas station. The owner would come in the morning and pick them up, take them down there. He met with the public, had a wonderful time. He said he could not be paid in American money in case he escaped. They were paid in coupons. That's what I wanted to show here. These are about the size of a raffle ticket, and so these could be exchanged in the camp canteen. This is a chow line near 11 Mile Corner, which is halfway between Casa Grande and Coolidge, or is it Eloy? No, Coolidge and Casa Grande. And this is you can see the big cotton processing center in the back there. Now, to put it mildly, these camps leaked like a sieve. The Germans were very poorly guarded, and so a lot of them escaped. And the ones who escaped, I asked them, why did you escape? Well, we knew we wouldn't be severely punished when we were recaptured. Well, I just wanted to be free for a day or so. So I would wander away from a cotton field. The guards would fall asleep, and we would wander away. And we would be recaptured the next day, where we would turn ourselves in. So there was a lot of these little escapes, many of them, over 70 or 80 at my last count. But the biggie, though, that everybody seems to want to talk about was the mass escape from Papago Park in Christmas of '44. And in fact, this last December 23rd was the 75th anniversary of it. These are all guys from Compound 1, and these are all men who the Americans called the so-called troublemakers, and these were all guys who were escape artists from other camps. They escaped from camps in Oklahoma, in Tennessee. They sent them to Papago and put them all in the same compound where they naturally escaped from. This is Wattenberg in the middle with his arms folded. But there's several big U-boat captains here. That's Fritz Guggenberger, Hans Werner Krauss, I interviewed him too. Jürgen Quate-Falslem. And some of these guys had escaped multiple times before from Papago. The guy kneeling in the middle is Kurt Mordiek, and he escaped 3 other times from Papago. So he knew where Sky Harbor was, he knew where to avoid that, he knew where the Tempe train station was, he knew where the local police stations were. And they started a tunnel in September of 1944, went out under the wire. 25 of them escaped. And to show you how lax the guarding was, the hole for the entrance was out in the open. It's right there. They would raise the lid on this coal box, and they would string laundry across it to hide it. The tunnel was 178 feet long, and it went eastward out under the fence and just on the bank of the Arizona Crosscut Canal. Here's the exit of the tunnel. This was photographed by the Americans afterwards. So the guy that made it the furthest was Heinrich Palmer. He was on the German Raider Thor, and he said that he's wearing his German Navy jacket in his picture. He said he made his knapsack out of his German Navy jacket. And he made it the furthest. Him and his partner, Reinhard Mark, walked at night from Phoenix to the Mexican border in 10 days. And he was 24 years old. He said, our plan was to get onto a neutral ship, it's like a Swedish ship, in one of the ports and make it back to Germany. And this is how he looked when I interviewed him in Germany. Said it was a wonderful time. He said that at night he could hear all the animals, and he said it was just absolutely beautiful, the moonlight. And they were captured. They went to fill up their canteens at a village in what was then called the Papago Reservation. It's now called the Tohono O'odham Reservation near Sells. And they went to use this hand pump to get the water and made so much noise it alerted the people in the village. They then sent out the police, and they were captured the next day sleeping under a bush. So they took them to Sells, and the jail at Sells was full, so they took them to the home of one of the border officials, where his wife made them dinner. They played chess with some of the neighborhood kids. And he said all this time the people were coming up and pressing their hands up and faces up against the window to look at these dangerous escaped Germans. Now, I talked to a lot of the Arizonans about this time. I says, "Did you ever have any fear?" And they said, "No, we knew they weren't dangerous because we saw them every day. We became friends with a lot of them. But the one person that stirred up a lot of hysteria was Walter Winchell. And Walter Winchell, on his radio program and in his newspaper columns, really tried to whip up a lot of fear. And close your doors and lock your doors. They're going to come slit your throat in the night and all that other kind of stuff. And but the American people here, the Arizonans, didn't believe it at all. You know, Walter Winchell is buried here in Phoenix. I don't know why I did that anyway. So, well, and to show you how nonchalant the escape was, this appeared on page 5. This wasn't even front page news. And by the time this article appeared, 6 had already been recaptured. And $25, my dad, as a corporal in the Army Air Corps, earned about $25 a month. So that was significant money back then. Now, the idea for most of the escapees was to try and make it into Mexico, where they had the names and addresses of some Germans, expatriates living there. Well, these 3 prisoners did not like the idea of hiking all of the way into down to Mexico. This is from the left. This is Wolfgang Klaus, Wilhelm Gunther. He gave me this picture, and Fritz Uzzolino. They had a map of Arizona they had stolen out of a vehicle, and it showed the Gila River as a blue line that ran into the Colorado River. He thought, you know what we're going to do? We're going to build ourselves a kayak. We're going to sail down the Gila River to the Colorado and sail our way down to Mexico. And that's exactly what they tried. I asked one of them in a letter, draw me a sketch of the boat. And this is what they drew. They built it in the camp out of canvas and wood. And 2 days before the escape, and the story I'm about to tell you has been independently verified by other prisoners. 2 days before the escape, they wanted to see if the boat was seaworthy, so they picked a blind spot between 2 buildings and they dug a big pool, filled it with water, and floated the boat, and it didn't spring a leak. So they carried it out in various sections. They got down to the Gila, and of course, it was dry. And because in Germany, the rivers are full. I mean, the rivers are used for transporting commerce. The Rhine and all of that I've seen are huge rivers, and they just assumed, oh, this is going to be like the Rhine River. Well, no. So they threw the boat away, and they were recaptured soon after that. So. And here's some of the Americans searching the desert for the escapees. This comes from a guy named Ray Radicke. He was from Michigan, or Illinois. And here he is at the border with Mexico, and there was 1 guard for every 5 miles. So fortunately for the Americans, they didn't make it quite that far. But they were all eventually recaptured, and as like Heinrich Palmer said, after about a week, everything went back to the usual boring routine anyway. So, but when the war ended, some of the Germans did not want to leave for many reasons. The prime of which is their homeland, their towns or villages were under Russian occupation, and or most of their relatives were killed. And they loved it here so much. They couldn't believe the freedom, and they wanted to stay, and the Americans said, no. You came in as enemy aliens, you have to go back to Germany, apply for citizenship, and then return. So this was the time at their discharge that the Americans expected the most escapes. And so these are some prisoners leaving Papago for the last time. They're at the Tempe train station. You can see Camelback Mountain here. They're all wearing black dyed clothing with the letters PW in white very, very prominently. And so they were sent to California, put on ships at Long Beach and other harbors, and then through the Panama Canal and back to England, where they were processed and discharged. I'm often asked how many prisoners came back to live in the United States. I don't have a number for that because immigration records are private. I personally spoke to 3 of them that came back, and they came back through Canada because Canada had an open immigration policy in the 1950s. They needed men to work in the lumber industry. So these are prisoners carrying everything that they own on their backs, and they brought a lot of items back with them that they could trade on the black market. They knew the German economy was totally ruined, so they brought back things that they could barter for. And a lot of the farmers that the prisoners worked for, they had their addresses, and a lot of the farmers told me they would send things to the prisoners like soap and toothpaste and things like that they were very, very grateful for. The ones that were in the so-called Nazi compound in Florence, they were not discharged immediately. This is Paul Cern, who was in the PAC unit, the anti-tank unit. He was actually sent to England to repair the bomb damage from the V1 and the V2. And this is him, obviously, with his friend. And for 50 plus years afterwards, they were all billeted with English families. They weren't even in a camp. And he maintained friendship with this family for 50 years and would often go back and forth visiting them. So Gerhard Kohler had been back to visit us, oh gosh, I don't know how many times, at least half a dozen times, he and his wife. And one of the first things Gerhard wanted to do was to pick some Arizona cotton. So we drove out to Coolidge, and we went into this vast, and the fields out there are just massive. And so he wanted to go out, and I got this picture, and while I'm taking this picture, this truck pulls up, and there's a guy with a cowboy hat. And so I thought, uh-oh. I said, do you own this field? He goes, yeah, this is my field. What's going on? And so I told him the story. I goes, he's a German prisoner of war. He wants to pick cotton after all these years, and the only thing this guy said was, the cotton's not too good in this field. Go over there. That's the better cotton. So somehow Gerhard got this on the plane back to Germany, and in his home he had a glass jar that said Arizona Baumwolle, Arizona cotton. He used to call me every weekend for about 10 years just to say hi. And Hans Lammersdorf, who you saw was the anti-tank gunner in Africa, he wanted to stay in Arizona. He fell in love with it, but his wife, Reidun, was from Norway, and she couldn't take the heat here. So they compromised and moved up to Seattle, Washington. And this is one of the many trips he took, where I took a picture of him in front of the sleeping Indian mountain. Then Werner Hefner came back, and when I knew that Werner and his son George was coming, I wrote to the mayor of Florence, a wonderful woman named Kay Oti, and I said to Mayor Oti, I have a man coming back who picked cotton here during the war. Is it possible that he could see you? Not only did she send him a letter thanking him for his service during the war, she had us as an audience in the council chambers, and here is Werner getting a cowboy hat and a shirt from the mayor of Florence. And that's her in the middle with, that's his son George on the left. We went overlooking the camp. We went out to lunch. But the nicest reunion, this is Carl Durst on the left. He's the one that drew that picture of the Florence camp. Carl wrote me, he saw my ad in the newspaper, and he said, I'd really like to know if this particular man is still alive, but I don't remember his exact name. It's Bob Sims or Simons, but he was a farmer in Coolidge, and he was so kind to us. Everybody wanted to work for Bob because he treated us so well. And I said, Carl, I'll check. So I went to the library. I looked up in the Coolidge telephone book, nothing. I looked in Florence, nothing. I went then to the Casa Grande phone book and found a Bob Simmons Jr. So I said, okay, so I called him up. I explained myself. He said, that's me. I'm him. So I called Carl. Carl immediately, he and his wife made plans to come over to visit, and this is their reunion. That's Bob Simmons, the farmer, on the right. And we drove out to his former cotton field, and Carl spoke no English. I mean, you couldn't even say hello to him, okay? And Bob spoke no German. Bob had a very thick, he was from Oklahoma. Have you ever heard a thick Okie accent? Oh my gosh, I had a hard time understanding Bob. Wonderful man. And the two of them just went off by themselves, and they just talked, chatted back and forth, and I have a feeling that they understood everything that they were saying to each other. So, and that's it. Any questions? So I've answered everything. You have absolutely no questions whatsoever. Yes.
Please wait till we get a mic to you so everyone can hear who's listening at home.
Actually, I can repeat the question also. Oh, hello to everybody who's watching.
I have a question and then a short comment. The question is, did you ever learn of a book written by one of the prisoners of war? When I lived in Flagstaff, it would have been about 1955, 56, probably somewhere around there. My husband brought home a book from the Flagstaff Library that was written by one of the prisoners of war. And he told of spending the night in the cafeteria of Roosevelt School, which was on the corner of 7th Street and Southern, and there was a basement where the cafeteria was, and they also stored books there. And he said he wrote in a book that the German prisoners of war had spent the night there. And he also told another interesting story. I don't know, I don't want to take too much time, but I have not been able to find any record of any book. Do you know of any?
That's my book, because that's Hein Palmer's story. Hein Palmer and Reinhard Mark met up with the three boatmen, the three guys that wanted to build, and they broke into the cellar of Roosevelt School at 7th and Southern before they went off. And that is in my book. It comes right from Hein himself. My book is a first-person account, by the way. These are all their words without any of my interpretation, because obviously I wasn't there. So, but that is straight from my book, and I have 2 copies here that you can see them. And when they were leaving the basement, Hein Palmer told me they were storing textbooks down in this cellar. He took a textbook and in English wrote, "This is a nice place for a prisoner of war to rest on his way back to Germany," and put it back. But that is from Heinrich Palmer.
You told about them cleaning out the irrigation canals. Well, I would say ours was an irrigation ditch that served, and I did see when I was behind our house, because I was born and raised here in Phoenix, and they were cleaning out the irrigation ditch. And they laughed heartily when my little brother got spanked. And I was scared, and I ran in and told my mother that the German prisoners of war were out there cleaning the canal rather than the horses they usually had do it. And she says, "Don't worry, they're just boys."
Yeah.
There's
stories like that
boys.
in my book too. Helen Richardson told me a story where the prisoners would sneak onto their property and steal oranges and apples from there, and they would run in and tell their mom. They said, "Oh, they're just hungry. Don't worry about it." So
Yeah.
there's a lot of stories like that too.
Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. It's thoroughly enjoyable. I remember a lot about World War II, although I was very young. How is it that you speak German?
I'm sorry, who am I talking to? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm German on my mother's side, and it was also my double major at ASU. was history and German language. So. Right over there. No, I'm bringing these so that you can check them out of the library. So, actually, one of them has 2 of my books in it. One is the POWs, and my second book was on Arizona's military airfields during the war. My brother and I spent a couple of years flying all over Arizona, photographing and landing at the ones that we could still land at. But it's the same type of book. It's all a oral history. So if you want me to come back and talk on that, okay, take a sharp stick and poke Carter Rogers. And so then the other one is just my POW book. But the way I have it spelled out, from their capture through their internment, through their escape, through their returning home, it's all a first person. I wrote everything down in German, then I translated it into English. It took about 6.5 years. And it's all there, and I hope you enjoy it. We had one more?
I just wanted to make a comment. While these guys were living their cushy life in Arizona, my 20-year-old husband was on desert maneuvers at Yuma, and he went to the South Pacific, and he was in New Guinea, the Philippines, and in Japan to Hiroshima. And he was a farm boy also. It's very interesting that these guys help farmers in Arizona, because my husband was out fighting the Japanese.
A lot of the farmers told me if it wasn't for the prisoners, they were the last resort. They had school kids. I know of people from schools in Chandler and Tempe that were brought out to pick cotton, but if you're not an experienced cotton picker, it was very, very little. The Germans got to be quite good at it. They didn't necessarily like a lot of the work, because a lot of it was, very hot and everything, but they enjoyed getting out of the camp. And so yes, there's a lot of stories about, and again, I won't go into them because you can read them in my book about all of the work that they did. They did, and all over the United States, it wasn't just in Arizona. They did potato harvesting in Idaho. They did citrus harvesting in California, everywhere. Gerhard Kohler was discharged from a camp in Utah after he was taken out of Florence, where they did a lot of agricultural work there as well. Okay, one more?
Okay. I grew up in Mesa.
Hold it. I got 2 people talking here. I'm sorry, who's talking? Oh, okay. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Okay. I grew up in Mesa and lived on Southern Avenue by the railroad tracks. And across from us was a big farm field. And during the war, there were Italian prisoners there. And I could hear them singing songs at night in Italian. Mm-hmm. And I felt very comfortable, not worried about it. And now I think back, and that was a special time. Thank you.
The Italians were very happy to be out of the war. From what I can glean, they weren't really behind Mussolini in his ideas of conquest. And talking to some former British soldiers who captured them in Italy, they gladly surrendered, because they knew that the Allies would treat them well. And historically, America has always treated its enemy prisoners of war very, very well, except for Andersonville, but that's another story.
I'm wondering what happened to the Japanese. We must have had Japanese prisoners of war.
There were extremely few Japanese captured during the war. Most of them went to Australia, but there was a camp in Iowa that did have a handful. But you're talking about campaigns like Iwo Jima, for instance. Out of the 20,000 Japanese, or 25,000, only less than 200 lived. So we're talking massive percentages that were killed in battle. But I have a colleague in Australia that has done work with the Japanese prisoners that were sent there, simply because it was a lot closer. Any other?
We can take one more? I guess not.
All right.
Okay, thank you so much, Steve, for coming this morning. We have the certificate
Oh, thank you.
to thank you. and a
A check
picture
for
of
a check for $1,000? You didn't need to
check for
do that.
$1,000.
Wow.
and a poster with this handsome guy on it
God.
here.
That's from one of the 1940s dances at Falcon Field. My wife and I go there every year in Jitterbug. So, very nice. Well, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Please join us for Kirsten 2